Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you very much for listening today. Thank you also for the great feedback on the recent barbed wire episode. I've got some great stories from listeners about their own encounters with the devil's rope and some interesting fence building stories. I could probably make a podcast out of a couple of the emails I got. So hopefully you're not out having to pull wire in the cold winter weather that we've been having here in Texas. Also wanted to remind listeners about the upcoming Texas State Historical Association meeting. If you've been a listener for a while, you know I'm the current president of the Texas State Historical Association through March. We're having our big annual meeting, the biggest meeting of Texas history enthusiasts, academics, non-academics, people interested in genealogy, people interested in historical sites. There's nothing like it. We're going to have it in Houston, and it's going to be February 27th through March 1st. And you can go to am.tsha.events, or you can go to the main website at tshaonline.org. And you can register for the annual meeting there. When you can see all the programming that we're going to have, all the seminars, the various events. We're going to have a huge gala. We're going to have, for the first time in the history of the association, a Texana auction that is going to be really spectacular of authentic Texas historical artifacts and Texana and art and everything. You're not going to want to miss this, so go check that out. Well, today I want to talk a little bit about a place that is a good example of so many places in Texas that started with a pretty simple beginning and has continued to thrive and become something totally different. So we're going to go to West Texas, and in West Texas, the first thing you're going to want to find, especially in the old days, was water. So let's go to West Texas, searching for some water, and get wise about Texas. This story starts with some wells. Now, before Texas was settled by the Europeans and wells were dug, water would be used by the Indians where they would find it. And so you have a lot of natural springs. And as those springs come up through the ground, you have places that are designated as wells. And the Indians, of course, there were so many different tribes in Texas fighting with each other for dominance over different areas. And some tribes would travel more than others, as we've discussed on this podcast. And in West Texas, you had the Apache, and then you also, starting in the 1700s, had the Comanche. And the Comanches were famous for traveling vast distances, and they would know, because they had to, where the water was on all those distances. So in what I'd like to describe as kind of middle West Texas, north of the Rio Grande, south of the South Plains, there were a set of wells that came to be known as the Van Horn wells. Now, where there was water, there would be travel. And so the roads and trails that were built in the 1800s would spring up around these wells. So that's what happened. Mail riders who would take mail from San Antonio all the way to San Diego, they would pass Van Horn's wells. And then when the Butterfield stage route was laid out in 1859, there was a stage stop at these wells. Now, there are two gentlemen named Van Horn for whom these wells may have been named. Let me tell you about both of them, and then I'll tell you what the conclusion is. The first is a gentleman named Jefferson Van Horn. He was born in Pennsylvania. His father was an officer in the Continental Army in the American Revolution. He was also a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives in the late 1700s, as well as the U.S. House of Representatives in the very earliest 1800s, 1801 to 1805. The family would then move to Ohio, and Jefferson Van Horn would go to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1827. He would serve all over the country. He would serve in Missouri, Kansas, Louisiana. He'd serve in the Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. He'd serve in Florida. He fought for the United States Army in the Mexican War, and he kept being promoted on the battlefield. He was promoted to major during the Mexican War. He participated in the capture of Mexico City. Then he came back stateside. He served in Mississippi. He served in San Antonio. Now, in 1848, the United States wanted to establish a military post on the north side of the Rio Grande, opposite El Paso del Norte, which is now the Mexican city of Juarez. And so Jefferson Van Horn was sent out there to implement that order. So he had 6 companies of infantry. He had 275 wagons. He had about 2,500 pack animals. And he went out to that area through a southern route through Castroville in that area. And he established 2 different posts. He put some soldiers at the Presidio, San Elizario Presidio. And then he went to a ranch belonging to a man named Coon, Benjamin Franklin Coon. It was called Coon's Rancho. And he designated that where he was on that ranch as a post, but he didn't name it for anybody. He called it, quote, the post opposite El Paso, close quote. And so there he is occupying the post opposite El Paso. There was a little bit of dispute about the rent because Coons was charging a fair amount of rent, and some of the merchants in the populated area, of course, wanted that fort more in the town. They were led by a gentleman named James McGoffin. Soon, federal budget cuts, however, would eliminate the post opposite El Paso for a few years, but it was reestablished in an area called McGoffinville that McGoffin obviously played a large role in. It was established in 1854, and it was officially named Fort Bliss. Now, before the establishment of Fort Bliss, while Van Horn was still out there, there was a dispute between Texas and New Mexico as to jurisdiction in that area. And what made it important was the amount of salt deposits out there, which were very, very valuable. And Texas and New Mexico wanted to tax that salt. That dispute was finally resolved when Texas organized El Paso County. Now, this is, again, before the establishment of Fort Bliss. This is 1850, and Van Horn was in charge of the area because of the dispute, and the Texas government organized El Paso County, and Van Horn was more than happy to surrender his duties governing that area. So that's Jefferson Van Horn, and he would have watered his wagon train and pack animals at the Van Horn Wells. But let's meet the next Van Horn, James Judson Van Horn. James Van Horn also went to West Point later than Jefferson Van Horn. He served in New York. He moved out and was placed on frontier duty at Fort Davis, which is now in Jeff Davis County. And Fort Davis, by the way, if I may digress, is being redone, and I strongly recommend you go out there and look at it. It's beautiful. And one of the companies under his command was Company F of the 8th Infantry, and they were stationed at the Van Horn Wells. Of course, during this time, middle 1800s, you needed to protect that water because the Indian activity was fairly significant in West Texas. And of course, you had the stage station there. Now, Van Horn wasn't there long because when the Civil War started, Fort Davis was taken over by Confederate troops, and they actually put James Van Horn in prison for 11 months. Well, not really in prison, but he was not free to leave. He was eventually released in 1862, and he went on to serve in the Army of the Potomac. He was promoted to captain. He fought at the Battle of Antietam and several other Civil War battles. And then he went on to serve with the Yellowstone Expedition. Now, the Yellowstone Expedition, there was a geologist named Ferdinand Hayden who led an expedition in the early 1870s to survey what I'll call the Yellowstone area, Yellowstone National Park and the surrounded area. And of course, they would need soldiers. So Van Horn was on that expedition. That would result in the creation of Yellowstone National Park. So Van Horn really got around. He would serve in Wyoming. He would serve in the Dakotas. He would serve in Arizona. He would serve in Alabama. He would go back and forth to New Mexico. He served in Minnesota. He served in Montana. Went to Georgia, went to Florida, ended up in Cuba in 1898, where unfortunately he got sick and would never recover. The key difference, of course, for our purposes between James and Jefferson Van Horn is James Van Horn was actually in command of the Van Horn wells, and that is the answer to the question. The wells were named for James Judson Van Horn. All right, let's go back to about 1850, and I want to give you a little flavor of what it was like at the Van Horn wells and the surrounding area by recalling a story from a guy named William Edgar. William Edgar told this story in the early 1900s about a trip he took from San Antonio to El Paso. He was in charge of a 6-wagon train, and it was loaded with groceries. It was loaded with clothing. He was the sutler, or kind of a sutler was a merchant who would follow the army around typically and would provide, it was basically a mobile convenience store providing clothing and groceries and goods to the soldiers who would, of course, pay for those things. And it was pretty good business. And so that's what William Edgar was doing with his rolling convenience store of 6 wagons. And the wagon train he was following was a 200-wagon government expedition headed for El Paso and then on to New Mexico. And so they separated because the grass was good, the roads were hard to get down, and of course we had the water problem. And so Edgar split from the government wagon train one day at Fort Davis and went on ahead. He went on to camp, and some soldiers came into camp and said, well, they were going to look for water, and did Edgar want to go with them? And so Edgar agreed, but his horse broke down. His horse had lost a shoe or two, and he couldn't continue, so he was moving slower. He goes back to his wagon train, and he starts that wagon train going. So he's still ahead of the army, and he comes up on what he thinks is that lieutenant that invited him to join him. But what he discovers is it's actually 3 Indians with a pack horse. So he heads back to his wagon train, which soon is surrounded by Indians. So he circles it up, and he ties double ropes, which I don't know for sure what that means, but I'm assuming it's ropes aligned vertically between the wagons to corral his mules and try to protect against the attack he thinks coming, because the Indians these are Apaches, by the way, they're all around him, circling him, making noise, singing what he described as war songs, and he thought that the battle was on. But about dawn, they do this all night, and then about dawn, they just disappear. Well, later that morning, the government wagon train shows up to his location and is on their way to the Van Horn Wells. That's their destination. So they pass him, and he joins in behind them, and what he notices is all those Indians are on the high ground above watching the wagons. And so it turns out that the Apaches knew about the government wagons coming, and just like the famous Warren wagon train raid I covered in earlier podcast episodes, they wanted the big prize, which was the government wagon and all the mules, not that little 6-wagon train. So he follows them on. He camps at Van Horn Wells, and then they head south toward the Rio Grande, which is where the trail led before turning toward El Paso. And he is now following this government wagon train, and he notices for about 150 miles the Indians all on the high ground watching these wagon trains, but they never attacked. And the reason they didn't, he says, is because the government couldn't find enough water, and so they were abandoning these mules a few at a time. So if you can picture, they're just dropping these mules behind them, and that was enough to satisfy the Indians. So they never did get attacked. But that was your typical trip in 1850 around the Van Horn Wells area. Extremely dangerous. Well, let's fast forward to 1881, and now we have the railroad. The Texas and Pacific Railway came through the area of the Van Horn Wells, a little bit north of them, in 1881. And where you have railroads, you're going to have towns spring up, camps as the railroad was built. And, of course, you're going to have them where there's water. So some people began to settle north of the Van Horn Wells as the railroad was built. And they called the settlement Van Horn. There's a funny story of the first adult to die in the area, apparently, was a rancher named Goins. And Goins apparently suggested a motto for the town, quote, "This town is so healthy we had to shoot a man to start a cemetery," close quote. Shortly after that, Mr. Goins' brother-in-law shot him to death in a feud, so that's a bit of bad luck. The feud, by the way, was over a watering hole. The railroad would dig wells in addition to the seep water from the Van Horn Wells, and the town was off and running. Stores were built, a post office came, there was a school. According to the sources I was looking at, there were saloons and stores and pool halls and dance halls, but there wasn't a church until 1907, which sounds a little bit like Houston's history. In 1911, Culberson County was organized. That was named for David Culberson, who was a congressman, and Van Horn would become the county seat. The courthouse was built in 1914. And into the 1900s, tourism in West Texas started to grow, and a very famous highway ran through Van Horn called the Bankhead Highway. Let me tell you about that for a second. The Bankhead Highway was known as the Broadway of America, and it was completed in the 20s. And it was one of the earliest transcontinental highways in the United States. Now, this is way, way before interstates were built. It was begun in 1916, and it went from Washington, D.C. to San Diego, California, but it didn't go straight. It went through Alabama, where one of its biggest supporters, John Bankhead, was senator, because where these highways were built, of course, commercial development would follow. It entered Texas at Texarkana, went through Dallas, down Commerce Street, went through Fort Worth, Abilene, Midland, and Van Horn, and on to El Paso. So if you're looking for a road trip, drive the old Bankhead Highway. So tourism became a big business for Van Horn. Van Horn was actually incorporated as a city in 1945. But as you read about Van Horn, you're going to read a story of progress. And here's one of the interesting stories of progress occurred in the 70s when British Airways had the Concorde. Now, if you're my age, you remember the Concorde. It was the first supersonic jet airliner. It no longer flies, but for a while you could get from New York to London in about 3 hours, and having the Concorde was a big deal. So the president of the Van Horn Chamber of Commerce formally invited British Airways to make Van Horn, Texas, one of the Concorde's regular stops. Well, the Concorde, British Airways passed on that, selecting New York and Washington, D.C. instead, but maybe they should have come to Van Horn because in the 21st century, Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, started a space company that you may know of called Blue Origin, one of two private space companies, space travel businesses, along with Elon Musk's SpaceX. And he started buying up land around Van Horn for Blue Origin's intergalactic operations, which are occurring to this day. They've sent up a couple of dozen astronauts into space and continue. So Van Horn is now a spaceport and went from just some wells on an Indian trail to sending people into space. And that is a pretty interesting story of Texas perseverance. All right, well, now we come to the part of the episode I call Getting There, where I tell you how to go see the places I described in the episode. If you want to go to the Van Horn Wells, get on I-10 West. You'll hit Van Horn. roughly 5 hours west of San Antonio, a couple hours east of El Paso on I-10. The wells are actually located 12 miles south of Van Horn. If you're in the middle of town, go south on Highway 90, and you will see the 10 or 11 miles, maybe 12 south of town. You'll see the Van Horn Wells historical marker. And I'm going to give you a research project. Get on the Google and Google Bankhead Highway. Get you a map, and no matter where you are in Texas, because the highway ran about 850 miles through Texas, so you're going to find a piece of the Bankhead Highway to look at. And along that highway, there are some old gas stations and stuff, the old architecture that you'll enjoy seeing. But why don't you Google that and plan you a little road trip down the nearest portion of the Bankhead Highway. And finally, when you're in El Paso, you're going to want to go see the McGoffin home at 1120 McGoffin Avenue in El Paso, Texas. It's a state historic site, and be sure to say hello to the site manager, Danielle Brissett. Great THC site manager. And as far as traveling to space with Blue Origin, you're on your own on that one. I got no idea, but something tells me you can get on one of those rockets if you really try. So good luck with that. Thanks for that. Wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Thanks for listening. Like and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Wise About Texas. And if you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. Thanks again for listening. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.